Thank you all for being here. My name is Lisa Arkin. I'm Executive Director of Beyond Toxics. We are so fortunate and honored and blessed to be able to be together with our panelists today to talk about the plight of Oregon farm workers today here in Oregon. So today here in Oregon, right this very moment, the Oregon Health and Safety Administration, or OSHA, is doing lawmaking concerning farm workers and their exposure to pesticides. They will make their final decision by December 31st of this year. So it's critical that you understand this issue. But today, farm workers are toiling to bring the harvest in. And while they're doing that work, they're exposed to toxic pesticides, herbicides, and sometimes even rodenticides. These are chemicals that are ultra hazardous and cause cancer, neurological impairment and harm, reproductive harm, skin lesions, and cognitive impairment as well. Next slide, please. Even today, farm workers are saying in the hearings that we've been in that they don't have access to water to wash their hands before eating a meal. They have to walk 15 minutes to get to the nearest latrine. That if they should mention that they're sick from pesticide exposures, they risk losing their job. And don't forget, it's not like the employer you go to 9 to 5 and then you go home. Because Oregon doesn't allow immigrant workers to have driver's licenses, they often are working and living in the same place. They live on the farms, they live in the orchards. So to complain means you could risk losing not only your job, but your housing. And then what? Where will you go? Next slide, please. These are the kinds of on-the-ground equipment used to spray pesticides in the fields. And when you hear a grower say, pesticides don't drift, you take a look. And this is not even the aerial sprays, which are common. Pesticides move. They don't just stick on a leaf and stay there. I took these pictures of current farm worker housing in Oregon. These are shacks. Sometimes they're euphemistically called cabins, like you're on a beach and you're going to change your clothes in a cabana or something like that. They don't have insulation. Some of them don't even have regular floors. They don't have molding around the window to keep pesticide chemicals from drifting in. They don't have proper doors. The siding might not even touch. This is not a place of protection. And yet the rule that Oregon OSHA is proposing today is that farm workers shelter in place. That's what it's called, shelter in place in these kinds of buildings while a spray is happening right around them. It's not only the workers, sometimes they have families, and I know it's difficult to see, but I put red circles around the children's bicycles and toys. So there's elders, there's children also living there as well. And children are the most vulnerable to any kind of harm from these kinds of neurological and cancer-causing pesticides. So we're not happy that our state is not stepping up to protect farm workers. So here's some aerial shots. So the red line is around the cabins, the farm worker cabins. You can see they're right in the orchard, just 5 feet from a tree. 15 feet there, sorry, in this one. And the yellow line is what we'd like to see as a no spray buffer, at least 100 feet. At least that for a bit of humanity. Here's another one, another example. We just took some different pictures. We also took pictures of the homes of the growers. We haven't published those yet, but I think you'd find it interesting to see the differences. Growers' homes are usually high up on a hill. There's at least 80 to 100 foot buffer, no spray, and they put large trees and hedges to stop the air from carrying the pesticides to the homes. So that's bias. That's prejudice. It's racial prejudice. So those postcards are for you to please send a message to Oregon OSHA that we want Oregon to do the right thing. It's difficult to do as much as we'd like, but at least 100 feet. That's what California is doing. So at least that for no spray zone for farm worker housing.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming and participating tonight. I would like to start with Jim Garcia. I met Jim some years ago when I was involved with a student group, MECHA, and he's a strong leader, and he is a mentor of mine, and I'm very glad that he was able to be here tonight. And then as we go down the table, panelists, if you'd like to introduce yourselves and please tell us where you're from. Thank you.
I'm answering the first question.
No, you're just saying,
Okay.
introducing yourself.
Well, my name is Jim Garcia. Is this on here?
So I play music, so I know when the microphone's on, and I know not to do this. Expensive equipment. My name is Jim Garcia. I'm originally from Southern California, Riverside, California. My grandparents came from the state of Guanajuato, Mexico, and arrived in Southern California. And my parents were born and raised in Southern California. I've been here in Eugene since 1973 when I went to the University of Oregon. And I'm presently the Chicano Latino Student Program Coordinator at Lane Community College. And I'm also member of the Board of Directors of Oregon Human Development Corporation.
Hi, my name is Phil Carrasco. I'm president of Grupo, Latino Acción, Directa, a nonprofit where we make sure we talk about all the issues affecting the local Latinx community and do it on their terms, right? With no agenda except the one that's brought up during those conversations with our community. And so, was that just it?
Yeah, just
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sandra Hernández. I'm currently on the board of Beyond Toxics. I've been there since I would say about a month or so. And I'm also the coordinator of Latinos, Unidos, Siempre, a nonprofit youth-led organization in Salem. We work for all forms of social justice, and it's all youth-led. So it's really great to work there.
Hello everyone, my name is Lisa Costa. I'm from Salem, Oregon, and I volunteer with the youth group Latinos Unidos Siempre. I'm currently an intern, and yeah, that's about it.
Good afternoon, my name is Ramon Ramirez. I'm president of PCUN, the Oregon Farm Workers Union, and so glad to be here. I'm from Woodburn, Oregon.
And Ramon, just hold on to that. We'll start with you with the first question. What is your connection to the issue of workers and immigrants in Oregon, please?
My connection is that I'm the president of the Farm Worker Union. This is my 47th year in the farm worker movement. I had the honor to work under Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. I actually spent 5 hours with him like 10 days before he passed away, and I met with the executive board of the union in California, strategizing around how we're going to improve the lives and working conditions of farm workers here in the state of Oregon. So my work as president is I do policy work for the union, but I also lead the organizing team, so I'm directly involved in organizing farm workers. I do pesticide work. I do wage theft work, which means violations of minimum wage laws or anything having to do with farm workers not getting paid what they're supposed to. And I also am directing the sexual harassment project of farm worker women in the Willamette Valley. So I do organizing. I do contract administrations. We have about 3 contracts right now. They're small contracts where we have people working under collective bargaining agreements in the state. So I do that kind of work. So others are going to talk about, I've been an activist for many, many years in the Chicano movement and also with farm workers. In my capacity as president, I work on many, many issues, especially around immigrant rights. Currently, I think this is the worst that I've seen it in all the work that I've done with immigrant rights and farm worker organizing. Just recently, last week, we had 2 major raids in Woodburn. In February, we had a major raid again in Woodburn. For those that don't know, Oregon is on the top 10 list in the administration's targeting for states that voted against him and that are considered sanctuary states. So the largest raid that has taken place in the United States of America happened 2 blocks away from PCUN, when 19 farm workers were taken out. They were detained, arrested, and deported. 19 farm workers going to work. People put food on our table day in and day out, right? So much for Trump's going after the bad hombres, like he said, but they went after people that are putting food on our table. And a lot of these workers do not even make minimum wage, right? They don't have rights like every other worker has in America, right? Farm workers continue in 2017 not to have collective bargaining rights, not to have rights that protect them from dangerous pesticides or unhealthy working conditions in Oregon. And that has been the history of farm workers in America ever since the passage of the National Labor Relations Act that passed in 1935 to end labor strife in America. And a new deal was structured, and we had the formation of the first labor laws called the National Labor Relations Act that was passed in 1935. That law that was passed in 1935 excluded farm workers because when the New Deal got structured, the Northerners' labor interest negotiated with the Southerners, the business community, the Dixiecrats, and they agreed to do a national labor law on the condition that farm workers be excluded. And the reason why farm workers were excluded was because the majority of farm workers in 1935 were African Americans. And the Dixiecrats, during the negotiation table and negotiating with Northerners, these are the people that represented essentially large plantation owners who continued economic slavery against African Americans all the way into the 60s. So that's why farm workers have been excluded from national labor laws and protections. And the only reason why states like California and Oregon have protections, and I should mention Washington State, is because of all the local organizing that has gone on in our state capital and in the fields to improve the living and working conditions of farm workers. And I have to say that the city of Eugene and Lane County has been really strong supporters of the farm worker movement, strong supporters of our organization as we struggle to improve the lives and the working conditions of farm workers. You folks have been there for us. And farm workers can't do it on our own. We need to count on the support of all people. And so I just want to recognize that and give you a shout out for all the support that you have all given to the farm workers in the state of Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramon. Luis, what is your connection to the issue of workers and immigrants in Oregon?
I come from a family of immigrants who have settled here in Oregon. And growing up, I myself was forced into the farm worker life. I remember when I was a child, I would sleep under berry plants while my mother was hard at work. And though we were supposed to initially settle in Bakersfield, California, we moved here in Oregon, which is where I grew up for most of my life. So growing up, I always wanted to support the cause, support my people, because here in America, we face inhumane injustice that no one else should face.
Thank you. Sandra?
I myself am a first generation immigrant, and so everyone around, well, at the schools I went to, my community is made up majority of immigrants, and so that's where I come from, that's who I grew up with, and so it was inevitable that I now work for a youth-led organization, which is majority of youth who come from farm working families. And so these issues are very, very close to us. And I've also done a lot of volunteer work with PCUN. I actually went with Ramon to DC to advocate against a dangerous pesticide that is used nationwide and causes neurological damage for infants. And so this is something that it's not only important for me personally, but also important for the youth that I work with and now that I care for so much as my own family. So this is something that I see myself, doing now and for a long time.
Thank you. Yeah.
So yeah, well, my connection to the issue of workers and immigrants also stems from my parents' work and my extended family on my dad's side of the family. Primarily, they worked in Salinas, King City, Soledad for many years, and I remember going out and visiting them and just understanding how different and how privileged I was coming up, even just because we lived in San Jose and it was a little, there was more job opportunity there. As I moved up here to Oregon in 1993, through my parents' church, I met a lot of folks that were migrant farm workers as well. But increasingly we're working in the trades, in the building trades. And I know that the topic is farm workers, but immigrants are exploited in any number of these professions. So my connection to the issue of workers is that early on, I was the one that was happy to volunteer and translate for a lot of my friends that couldn't, understand most of the proceedings, from a simple parking ticket to renewing their license, to even some immigration processes, right? I got into the worker exploitation primarily through policy work, thanks to the 3 p.m. program at the U of O, and started noticing how there were a lot of loopholes where corporations could get big tax cuts or even defer their the taxes they need to be paying. And at the same time hiring a lot of undocumented workers and exploiting them, right? Well, we as a city are okay with giving them, almost $10 million worth of tax cuts, right? So my connection to the issue of workers is just something that I know I have in my values, and that I want to make sure that I'm using every bit of privilege that I know I have to make sure that I expose it, work against any type of bad policies, and try to promote good policies at the same time. The work that we do through Grupo Latino de Acción Directa is primarily trying to come to terms with the fact that there is no one leader in our community, and quite frankly, the most courageous and the most wise folks are the ones that are definitely in these situations. They were courageous enough to come to another country, sometimes uproot their whole family, and they definitely are wise enough and smart enough. Sometimes they're some of the best business folk in our community. They have long-standing, bodegas here, restaurants, and are really an economic engine for our county and our city. So yeah.
Well, my connection to workers and farm workers, immigrants, is my grandfather came to this country, he bought 8 acres of land, and so he made his living growing corn, squash, whatever he could to engage in his living. Raised in Riverside County, that's where I was first exposed to the farm workers movement via the media. So I knew what farm work was, agricultural work. But the way the media was presenting the farm workers in Coachella Valley with the grape strikes and so forth was a very different picture than what my grandparents and my parents taught me about work. And so that was my first exposure to kind of getting some doubt about what was being said to me by the outside world about who I was and who we were as Mexican Americans. My last year here, my senior year at the University of Oregon, I volunteered as a tutor at the high school equivalency program. That was in 1976, 77. And it's called HEP, and that's a program for migrant farm workers to study for their GED tests and also to be placed in college or in a job outside of the agricultural force. So I did that for 8 years, and it was a very rewarding experience for me to get to know students from Northern California, from Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. As I worked at the University of Oregon, I continued to my connection with migrant education through leadership conferences that migrant education folks would provide for students in Eastern Oregon and Pendleton and Salem as well. So throughout my career, it's been serving immigrant populations, Latinos, farm workers. Presently, I've been serving on the board of directors for the Oregon Human Development Corporation, and OHDC has been in operation since 1979. And its primary service delivery is farm workers, low-income populations. So it's been rewarding to serve on that board, to kind of answer the questions that are going to follow up. I'll respond to it at that time, but it's been a very rewarding experience. In June, I was selected as the chair of the board, so it's a new responsibility. It gets me more connected with what's happening with the day-to-day operations of our office. Our office serves farm worker populations in Klamath Falls, Ontario, Hermiston, Hillsborough, Hood River, some parts of Nevada, so it's a pretty extensive organization.
Thank you, Jim. And in your experience, what is the top issue or concern facing immigrant workers in Oregon today?
Well, I think this is part of reflective of my my career here in Eugene, Springfield at the University of Oregon and Lane Community College. Hearing the stories from students in the schools, it's similar to the stories that I'm hearing from farm worker populations, is that we have systems in place, public systems, that are not responsive to the experiences of farm workers. And I think that's the number one issue to me. Many years ago in the 70s, there was a program called Chicano Fair Center, because the county services that are available to all folks just didn't serve Latinos, didn't serve Chicanos, Mexican Americans like me. So I think that's still a problem that we have right now. We have systems in place, publicly funded, and they are responsive to some populations, but for the farm worker population, as Ramon mentioned, it's just not happening still. And it's a shame, and we need everyone's support for this, not just the folks you see up here, but your participation. And I think that's the number one thing for me, is that we need to make sure these systems are accountable to all residents.
Thank you. Phil, in your experience, what is the top issue or concern facing immigrant workers in Oregon today?
There are obviously many issues, and I know folks like Jim and Ramon and could really talk about the context here, because they're my elders. However, the top issue really is about the anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? That leaves no appetite for folks to really address immigration reform, let alone worker standards, right? On the receiving end of low wages. So the top issues I know are immigration reform, and as I mentioned, there's no appetite for anything while we face the type of administration that readily demonizes our people. But there's also the raids, right? Ramon spoke about the raids just occurring in Woodburn, and sometimes it's not even the raid itself, but the imminent threat, of a raid. All the children that go to school, all the children that can't even, concentrate on what they're doing. A lot of DACA recipients, come from these families, and they're facing the same fear when they thought they had their foot in the door to really have their family be successful and live the American dream, right? Whatever that is, the American dream, and they find themselves now with ICE at their door, just like their parents were. So The other issue that I'd like to mention is the abuse or assault on women, perhaps by even folks that oversee a lot of these farm workers. And then obviously the living conditions that we were just talking about. They call them cabins, they call them whatever they will. There's still a very horrible housing, and living condition. So I know there's no amanecer, and I'm sure Ramon's going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm sure there's a lot of appetite and a lot of energy from our own activist community to try and promote more of these things and housing standards for our farm workers statewide.
Thank you, Phil. Sandra, in your experience, what is the top issue or concern facing immigrant workers in Oregon today?
I think what was said, I echo what was said right now in terms of raids and fear in immigration reform. Because of that, the health of farm workers is being left at the end. As I mentioned, I attended a lobbying trip to DC to ban a pesticide that is really dangerous to infants. And while we're fighting for an immigration reform, there's people who are literally dying because of the pesticides that they're being exposed to, and that is very unfair to our community. I'm also part of the Willamette Valley Resistance Collective, which is a collective to basically respond to ICE raids and give Know Your Rights workshops, and through that we've learned that there is so much work to do around Know Your Rights for immigrants and their families. They're having so many raids in our community, especially in Woodburn, where the community is majority of farm workers, and because of that, like we haven't even had the time to talk about pesticides. We haven't had the time to bring back what we learned in DC to our community and to our youth so that we can start organizing around that. There's just no time for it, and it's not fair to our community. It's not fair to our youth and their families who have to worry about these policies while putting their health aside. And and I hear a lot of conversations about, oh, these farm workers are bringing our food. To a lot of people, these farm workers are bringing their food, but to us, that's our family. That's us. That's not just some people bringing our food to the table. That's our community, and it's not fair. And so I think that while organizing around immigration reform, we should also ensure that our people are having a voice and are being organized around pesticides and healthcare issues. Thankfully, healthcare for all kids passed, and because of that, a lot of the youth that have been exposed to pesticides or that will have any other health issue will have some sort of healthcare, but their parents still don't have it. And once they turn 19 or 20 years old, they won't have any type of healthcare. So that's something that I think is very pressing and that we should really focus on.
Thank you. Luis, as a youth, in your experience, what is the top issue or concern facing immigrant workers in Oregon today?
I think that here in Oregon, there's a ton of racism and discrimination among immigrant workers. Back in 2014, there was a campaign that was supposed to give immigration workers driver's licenses so that they could drive freely and without fear. The Oregon being as conservative as it is, that campaign lost by a landslide, meaning that Oregon's not as progressive as we think it is when it comes to immigration issues. And what we really have to do is change that and help support these people.
Thank you. Ramon.
Yeah. I want to just echo what everybody says. I think, we have a lot of problems. Farm workers, immigrant workers have a lot of problems. I would say like immigration, wages, pesticides. But I want to focus on a couple of things that people are not aware of. First of all, I want to say that about 70% of the farm workers that pick our crops in the Willamette Valley are undocumented. In addition to that, we have a large sector of our population of farm workers are indigenous, meaning that they're from either central or southern Mexico or Central America. In the town I live in, which is Woodburn, we have we've identified 16 different groups of indigenous folks. Some of them you'll know, like Mixteco, Mixteco Bajo, Mixteco Alto, Trique, Zapoteco, Miche. We have one of the largest Purepecha communities in the country. In addition, we have Canjobal from Guatemala. We have a lot of those folks living in Woodburn. And so a lot of these folks are undocumented. So there's a lot of fear and anxiety. And I would say that the very fabric of our community that holds the psychic of our community, the psychological fabric of our community is coming apart. And I think Sandra mentioned it, I think Jim also mentioned it, that you know, there's a lot of these raids are having a tremendous effect, or a fear of a raid is having a tremendous effect. So we have to deal with that on one front. And then the other thing that's really hardly ever talked about is the healthcare of farm workers, right? You know, farm workers, the life expectancy rate of a farm worker is 49 years of age compared to 78 for the general population.
Wow.
Right? Cancer rate among farm workers is 25% higher than the general population. In the county I live in, Marion County, there was a study done by some interns at the Salud Medical Center, which is in Woodburn, that noticed a rash of miscarriages among farm worker women. So they documented for about a year. This is unscientific because there's never been a national study done of farm worker health.
Wow.
There hasn't been. We've been advocating not only through the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, but also to the Department of Labor and also USDA, that a national study needs to happen so that we can determine what the long-term acute effect of pesticides are having in our community. Because they're having an effect. So these interns determined that the miscarriage rate among farm worker women was 50% higher than the general population. There's something wrong with that picture. In addition to that, I would say that since there's never been a study done, a national study done, we can only determine, because I visited different, I probably visited almost all the farm worker communities in the country. And it's the same conditions that exist. Whether you're in Florida, upstate New York, North Carolina, Idaho, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, on and on and on. It's all the same. You can go to Google farm worker health on Google it or however you look for a search engine, and you'll find statistics by all the national health organizations that work directly with farm worker populations that the results are the same. And yet, there's never been a national study done of farm workers. Sandra was talking about a pesticide called chlorophyllisphos, which was developed by the Nazis during World War II, and was modified to be a pesticide in the 60s. And even the EPA last year was going to ban it before the election happened, because even the scientists in EPA determined that that pesticide, any amount, even to drift, would cause neurological damage among children and pregnant women. The election happened, Pruitt gets nominated EPA head and determines that he's not going to ban it anymore. When we have scientific proof that it causes neurological damage among the consuming public, right? A lot of the schools in the Willamette Valley they border fields where this pesticide is being sprayed, right? Last thing I will say is that one of our first tasks that we did when we formed the union back in 1985, 31 years ago, we filed a lawsuit to ban a really bad chemical called Dinoset. According to the National Pesticide Center in San Francisco, led by Dr. Marion Moses, Cesar Chavez's physician, called us up and said, you guys gotta work on banning this. So we did. We joined the federal lawsuit. We got the pesticide banned. And that was in 1987. We got it banned. In 1995, the city of Salem, their Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, was testing the groundwater of the city of Salem, the groundwater people drink, right, in Salem, and there was unacceptable traces 9 years later of Dynacep in the water. So we don't know what the long-term effect these chemicals have on the consuming public. But we do know that they're poisoning and killing farm workers. 49 years of age is not acceptable. Am I right? Yes or no?
Yes, Ramon.
Thank you.
And this third question, we've all answered a lot of, but I want to give an opportunity if we're missing anything. Are there any issues made worse by federal or state policies?
Well, I would just say, I'll just be fair. I'll take one federal and one state, okay? And then, but there's, 30 years ago, our PCUN and many other organizations, I can name them, the Oregon Law Center, LASO, Legal Services of Oregon, and we were all involved in a case in which the police, state police and local police officials were staging immigration or staging accidents on public highways that were leading to places where farm workers were living, were working. And in Woodburn, they set up roadblocks. In Forest Grove, they turned over a school bus to make it look like it's an accident. And right behind the school buses were immigration buses. And they were profiling people. Anybody Latino going on that road must be undocumented, and that's what they were doing. That was the genesis for the 181 law-820 that created, who would have known that 30 years later that they would be called a sanctuary, But what that law did was, and it was introduced by the first Latino elected official in the state of Oregon, Rocky Barria from Salem. And he introduced a bill that would prohibit law enforcement agencies in the state of Oregon, whether it be local law enforcement, state police, or county police, from enforcing immigration law. And I have to tell you that law is really, really important to us. Because I've been to Alabama. In fact, I walked from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama in the footsteps of our civil rights leaders in America to fight for civil rights. And we were invited 5 years ago on the 50th anniversary of that iconic march by the black leadership. I got a call from State Senator Hank Sanders, and he out of the blue and says, Ramon, you might not know who I am, but my name is Hank Sanders. I'm a state senator from Alabama, and I want to invite your people to come and march with us on the 50th anniversary of that walk from Selma to Montgomery, because we're going to honor undocumented folks that contribute to our economic prosperity in America. Can you come? I said, hell yeah, we'll come. How many people you need? Bring all your people. So 10,000 people showed up, immigrants, and we made that march. In part because Alabama had just passed one of the most draconic immigration laws, worse than Arizona, that gave authority to local law enforcement to act as immigration agents in the state of Alabama. A law that now in Texas they now have, because the Supreme Court in Texas have overturned that law from being unconstitutional and given police that right. While in the state of Oregon, we have a law that prohibits local law enforcement from acting as immigration agents, right? Thanks to all the efforts that were done 30 years ago. Well, there is a ballot measure right now. It's called IP 22 that want to overturn that. And it's led by a group called the Oregonians for Immigration Reform. They're an anti-immigrant group. They're considered by the Southern Poverty Law Center to be not only a hate group, but they're considered to be a racist group. And they operate here in the state of Oregon. And they're going around trying to get a petition to put it on the ballot measure for 2018. That, to me, if that passes, would revert our state of Oregon into a state like Alabama or Texas, and we cannot let that happen, right? Right. We gotta fight back with everything we have. That is the single most dangerous thing, that when people say, what's important to immigrants, what's important to our state? Because, remember, right, we're only as strong as our weakest link, right? If the rights of immigrant people are not protected, then our rights are in jeopardy. Thank you.
Amen.
Luis, are there any issues made worse by federal or state policies?
I think that ever since Donald Trump was elected president, there's been a lot of hate and fear rising all across the United States. Donald has supported ICE, he's supported deportation, and in part this led to ICE's national budget to increase, Where I'm from, there's been a total of 6 ICE raids in my local community. Donald's support of ICE has increased detentional facilities dramatically to what it is today.
Thank you. Sandra?
And I'm just going to echo what y'all said. Y'all made really great points, and the facilities are a huge issue in Oregon, where the rights of immigrants who are being held there are being violated, and on a daily basis. And so that's one of the issues that we're currently also fighting against.
Like, did you say there's a detention facility in Oregon?
Yeah, in Norcourt, we were there protesting a facility. It's a local state facility, but they were holding people for ICE.
Where's that? Where's that?
In
The Dallas.
the Dallas, Southern. And also in Salem, around March or April, there was a detention. A youth was detained by ICE at the Marion County Juvenile Department as he was entering his court hearing. ICE showed up and detained him. So that protection, there's no protection for people, and I think that's a lack of policy rather than a policy.
Thank you. Phil?
So yeah, again, I think I will be echoing most of what folks mentioned, but I don't mind echoing Initiative Petition 22. Ramon is right. This is very important. There are the law 181.182A.820, is the Oregon State statute which clearly defined that local municipalities would not use the funds given to local law enforcement to enforce immigration, any type of ICE activity, right? It's been a long time since that's been working just fine. And Initiative Petition 22 is really trying to get rid of this, right? Because they believe the rhetoric that's coming out of a Trump administration, right? That, immigrants are just criminals, they're just really, they don't bring good values, we're bad hombres, whatever. And by the help of OFER, Oregonians for Immigration Reform, such as, just like Ramon just mentioned, and then just recently, the support by Jeff Sessions being around in Oregon, and the type of people that they invite over here as well, like in the past they've invited Sheriff Joe Arpaio to speak at their rallies. And they had very anti-union, anti-collective bargaining groups also participate, like the Freedom Foundation. So as you see, it's really about dividing people, because the powers that be need to be making money. How do you do that? You reduce collective power. How do you do that? You pit one group against another group. How do you do that? By dehumanizing the farm workers or immigrant workers. And this is their little machine going at it every day. So as time goes, you'll be able to sign, maybe most of you already signed the pledge to not support initiative petition 22 and to retain our long-standing, almost 30-year-old Oregon state statute, which is protecting a lot of our folks. So we'll be probably talking more about that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Yes, I think my response to this question is just kind of letting people should ponder about whether the system we have in place is responsive to our humanity. As Phil mentioned, the system that's been in place here for over 500 years has been to serve to divide categories of human populations, and by that you're able to treat those populations accordingly. So I think we should understand that we're under a systemic framework that we're kind of thinking that we can use to the benefit of all, and it's not set up to use for the benefit of all. Just the example about the health issue. We have a National Institute of Health. Why don't they do research on farm workers? I mean, that's my point from the beginning. We have systems in place, but they're not doing that. So there's a lot of great effort that we have done over the years. The Trump thing that happened in November, you know what? The system was in place before Trump. We had Clinton, we had Obama, we had Kennedy, we had Johnson, and the system is still in place. The farm worker issue is still there. So that tells me it's not about a person, it's more about a system that promotes that. And I think we need to be aware of that we have to change the system that's be more inclusive, and to not even see immigrants, not even use that language of immigrants or farm workers, but to start from the very basic that we're all human beings, and not start from the category that's been given to us to look at populations and say it's all right? Because when I see change that happens for farm workers, it happens to affect everybody else. And that's one of the things I've heard advocates over the past 30 or 40 years that I've been involved with this, is that, these folks pick the food. You're not picking your own food, right? And so we need to make that connection. And as Phil mentioned, we are working with a system that allows us to divide our humanity, divide these issues, so that things can go on as if we're not connected to that. And we are connected to that. And again, I want to just restate what Ramon mentioned. Understand the legacy of agricultural work with Latinos. They're not Hispanics, they're not Latinos. They come from indigenous communities. We are an indigenous community. As Ramon mentioned, there's a lot of Purépechas in that area. My family comes from the Purépecha people. So before I'm Mexican, before I'm from Guanajuato, from California, I am Purépecha. And I want to make sure that people see me as that, as opposed to just a Mexican or Hispanic, because these are categories that are given to us. So the policies we have in place, well, in my interaction with the Oregon Human Development Corporation, we receive a lot of federal grants. A lot of politics out there, and that's what it is. It's just politics. And give us the money to serve farm workers, but if they have better lobbyists over there in Washington, D.C., who knows what we're going to get. So we need your help. We're all connected to this. I think it's a shift that we all need to look at ourselves. We cannot disconnect ourselves from anything here, right? And so I really appreciate the efforts of the folks on this panel and many others in the community who have tried to respond to the needs of farm workers, but we need everyone's help. That's all I can say.
Okay, Jim, and on that, what are your suggestions for improving working conditions, easing the burdens facing immigrant workers? In other words, what can we do in Oregon to treat workers with ethical standards based on justice and equality?
Right. My response to that is accountability. So we just got to make sure that our Lane County Health Department is responsible to farm worker issues, right? The state of Oregon, everything that's in place already. we need to make them accountable to respond to the issues of farm worker experiences. I think that's, why are we recreating something else? I appreciate the efforts that people have made to directly serve farm workers, but we can't be doing this alone. So I think all of us need to make sure that our political systems, our economic systems, our educational systems are responsive to the experiences of being a farm worker here. Because farm workers are not only putting food on our tables, but they're contributing to this economy, they contribute to our society, to our country here. In the service, in the military, you name it. Farm workers, immigrant populations are there. And we need to make all of our institutions and the so-called leaders that are elected or that are appointed to make them accountable to these issues here. I recently, as a board of director chair, met with a U.S. representative to talk about the services at Oregon Human Development Corporation, and stated, not only stated the services that we invited the clients to speak with the representative, and she was there to hear their stories. It was a no-brainer. She understood how important her work is in Congress to make sure we have money for these services. We need to humanize our way of working, our way of approaching issues. And as Phil has mentioned, we're using a system that dehumanizes, that demonizes communities. And if we use a framework that is already in place to dehumanize and demonize folks, it's not going to get us there. We're going to have this conversation in spite of the great efforts of many people, 20 years from now, 40 years from now. The goal is to change that framework to say, reclaim our humanity. I think that's what we need to do, and ask if those policies, as I do in my work at the University of Oregon, Oregon State, and Lane Community College, how is that going to help an immigrant student? How is that going to help a DACA student? Great idea. So it's the model in the country, but how does it respond to these experiences here? And that's the question I always pose, and I encourage all of you to pose those same questions.
Thank you, Jim. Phil, what can we do in Oregon to treat workers with ethical standards based on justice and equality?
So, I mean, one of the things I do want to talk about is how important it is to correct history, right? This explanation of the agricultural workers and why they're usually left outside of some of the labor standards for this country. How many of you knew that it went back to slavery? That it was tied to slavery? If you didn't, and that's something new you just found out, that's great. But we need to keep talking about this. We need to let people know how it's literally tied to slavery. Some of the biggest shame that this country has, right? Obviously, we got to talk about Kalapuya land, where they're farming, right? So one of the main important things to do is talk about the realities and corrective history, but also, do the type of things and something Jim mentioned, structure society to benefit farm workers, right? Ramon mentioned it. Not even a nationwide study has been made, right? How are you ever going to change the structure to benefit a farm worker if you can't even put the money and commission a study to see where the health of a farm worker is at in this nation? That shows you what priorities you have, the country has. So other things that, is always mentioned is boycotting, right? Boycotting certain products. We need to equalize the powers any which way that we can. That's why a lot of folks organize, equalize the powers at the bargaining table. But another way of doing it is making sure we're really on top of what type of products we are boycotting, which ones we're supporting, which ones we're buying, which ones we're not. We definitely need to start tipping the balance of power. Nowadays with social media, I mean, it's super fast and viral the way that we could ridicule even some bad practices from corporations. We have a lot of power there. So that's another thing. One of the most important things that I do through Grupo Latino de Acción Directa that I think is just the basis of it. Anybody could put together a forum. Anybody could put together any type of community engagement piece. But you need to start thinking in terms of self-determination, right? That's the way I've always tried my best. I find it sometimes pretty insulting when you go to address a community and you just kind of tell them what your agenda is, and then you're gonna educate them, right? When they can tell you so much more about their story. So through Grupo Latino de Acción Directa and the forums that we do, that's specifically the formula. The moment they're engaging the powers that be, let's say it's the sheriff of Lane County, talking about their issues, we immediately, withdraw from that whole equation and allow them to have that conversation and establish that relationship. So self-determination is very powerful, and that's the only way we could ever really create a structure that benefits the farm workers and migrant workers, right? So, yeah, that's what it is.
Thank you, Phil. Sandra, what are your suggestions for improving working conditions, easing the burdens faced immigrant workers? In other words, what can we do in Oregon to treat workers with ethical standards based on justice and equality?
I think the key word to the answer is workers, right? We often talk about immigration reform, but what happens when somebody becomes a citizen? Then that person automatically gets citizenship rights. But then the very fight we had is left behind, because there will still be people who have no citizenship, who have no protection, and who will be treated as nothing because of that. And so I think as workers, that we need to ensure that the growers are held accountable to uphold labor rights that already exist in this nation, that are often just not that they're not supposed to include farm workers, but they often are let not to include farm workers. So in other words, they get away with not giving farm workers labor rights and ensuring their basic needs, such as clean water, breaks. Right now, those are some of the basic things that we can do for farm workers, and obviously including the farm workers in the economic justice movement. We often talk about economic justice and people low income, but we often forget about farm workers. We often forget about their families. And I think that's a step into ensuring that some of the burdens that are faced by farm workers are eased. And so this question is not, whether we will find an answer right now, but what can we do right now to ease the burdens faced by farm workers and their families? And I think it starts by ensuring that them as workers are treated as workers and are given the rights that any other worker in this country is given once you start to work anywhere. Those same rights need to be applied to every single person, regardless of other status.
Thank you. Luis, what are your suggestions for improving working conditions, easing the burdens faced by immigrant workers? In other words, what can we do in Oregon to treat workers with ethical standards based on justice and equality?
I think that more than just having us guest speakers here today advocating for the inhumane conditions farm workers are facing, we need to have more actual farm workers affected in higher positions of power. Because if they're more upfront about the issues they're being affected by, we can learn more about what changes need to be made so that we can fix the inhumane conditions that they face from day-to-day life.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple of suggestions. First of all, I want to just footnote that the reason I brought up the issue of Alabama and that march was because one of the reasons why we got invited was on the march from Selma to Montgomery, we spotted over 100 cars abandoned in the highway. And it was a testimony that those cars were abandoned because those cars were owned at one time by immigrants, and that they had no place. They had arrested so many people in the state of Alabama, they had no space, the tow trucks, to house these cars. So they're left in the highway. As a testimony of how bad this immigration law in Alabama was, right? So I just wanted to footnote that. I had completely forgotten, got emotional. So, but there's a couple of things that as we were talking, I think I like the point about this is more institutional, that we have to do all we can to change the institutional power that exists that creates the inequities and imbalance. that perpetuates racism and indifference and xenophobia and sexism and homophobia. So I like that point, but there was a couple of things that I think one of the things that farm workers this last couple of years have been really interesting in that we elected in our legislature the first Latina immigrant farm worker to the House of Representatives in the state of Oregon. Her name is Representative Teresa Alonso Leon from House District 22 from Woodburn, Oregon. We elected her, so building political power is first and foremost is what we need to do, and build coalitions so that we could work together. And I raise this because had she not been there, we would have had some laws that people thought were good, but had ramifications for immigrant people. One was, for example, there was a bill that people were promoting that would criminalize youth from smoking, right? And so she gave me a call. She says, "What do you think about that?" And I go, "Well, who do you think they're going to target, right? Who do you think they're going to target in terms of, if they lower the age lower the age on smoking, they're going to go after people of color, African American, Latinos, immigrants, undocumented immigrants." And so, a light went off, and she went and presented that to her caucus and says, "I'm not in agreement with that law," and it died. And there's a lot of examples like that, right? By having a person that's most affected, like what this brother said, most affected, understand, the politics behind that. So we need more of that. The other thing I think we need to do is build bridges of understanding among all our communities. We have to learn how to live together. We have to learn how to respect each other, and we have to honor diversity. And I think if we do that, we'll live in a better society. Lastly, I'd say that if you want to support farm workers, here's a concrete way of supporting farm workers. 9 years ago, the 3 farm worker unions in America, United Farm Workers Union of America, founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, FLOC, Farm Labor Organizing Committee, they're based in Ohio and North Carolina, and PCUN. We started working with Oxfam America, and we brought in some other stakeholders from the pesticide community, from food safety. We have the Consumer Federation of America, the folks that are behind the equalized scares in meats. And we brought in some retailers. And we started working at developing a certification label with meaningful worker rights standards, front and center of that label. Because all the food safety certification labels, they have front and center of those labels are not, they don't have farm workers in there. Farm workers are not in the equation with that certification label. It's about the food safety, right? Not the worker safety. So we developed a label called Equitable Food Initiative, called EFI. And EFI, Equitable Food Initiative. It's a label. We have worker rights standards. And we're trying to change the way agriculture does business in America and in the world, and give, for the first time, workers a say in the workplace. How are we doing that? Well, we developed this label, and we've brought in some of the retailers to come in and say, for example, if growers want to opt into this system, Costco is willing to pay. For example, we have Costco and Whole Foods on board, is willing to pay a premium. The profit margin of a grower is anywhere from like 4 to 6% in the Willamette Valley. Very high is probably about 8% on a good year. Costco is willing to pay 15% if people opt in. Right? Whole Foods is the same thing. So we have currently, we launched the project about after 9 years, about a year and a half ago. We have 40 farms under contract, representing 16,000 workers. And we're just starting in 3 countries. Those countries are Mexico, Canada, and the US. We're about to open up, we're about to certify our first farm in Guatemala and in Peru.
And what kind of standards do you have?
We have a website, so it's called Equitable Food Initiative. You can Google it and go into the website, and we have the standards there. We have a food safety standard, we have a worker standards, and we have a pesticide standards. And so we just launched the label. It's called EFI. It's called Grow Responsible Farm Worker Assured. And so we're asking people, they're going to support farm workers. The best way you can support farm workers is by buying EFI product at these social stores. In our website, we have also a list of other retailers and other places where you can buy the product. So that's one way you can do that, is buy, and you can do that now, because there's Costco here in Eugene, right? Yeah, I checked, before coming down, I checked Costco at Wilsonville, and they had our strawberries there, and they had our tomatoes there. Also, we have Nature Sweet tomatoes, those little cherry tomatoes. They're in a yellow, really bright yellow crab shell, right? Nature Sweet with the little tomatoes in there. That's also certified. I happen to be at that farm that got certified in Mexico, and they pay the farm workers in Mexico 300% higher minimum wage-wise than those workers and otherwise. There's a process for you to develop and make a higher wage and grow in the company. It's an awesome company. So that's one way you can support us, is by buying EFI product at those two places.
And now we'd like to open the floor up for questions, please. John, can you grab the microphone?
Ramon, you spoke about a little bit on this.
I'm sorry. Can you please tell us?
Oh, sorry. My name is Gonz Serrano. I know not everybody watched the movie, but there was a part in it where a lot of movement leaders from separate organizations, separate movements came together and they spoke of each other. Of Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, there was like Coretta Scott King, there was Angela Davis, Gloria Steinem, and everybody spoke of each other with such high reverence. And it was a really high point of the movie for me. And you spoke a little on that, going to Selma and being in solidarity with them. And I'd just like to hear from the other panel, or from the rest of the panel, on how they feel about the importance of that, about intersectionality through the movements.
As it was mentioned in the movie, we talk about intersectionality now as if it's something new, but obviously it hasn't been. In the film, they mentioned that we often think about the movements as separate, or as separate movements. The movement of the African Americans, movement of Latinos or Chicanos, and movement of Native Americans, but all the leaders were connected. And I think it's still the same way now. And if we forget that, we forget the intersectionalities that we, even ourselves, that we live, then we're not doing our job. As it has been mentioned, farm workers are not just, coming from Mexico. They are coming from all over Latin America. And the majority of farm workers do not consider themselves Latinos. And that's being talked about. Their first language isn't even Spanish a lot of the times. So we have to question, how, when we present an issue, how are we presenting it? It is very, very important that we ensure that people's complex identities and complex stories are being told to ensure that the issues that are affecting us the most are truly fixed. And so I think that the film made a great point around that, and I think we should continue to ensure that intersectionalities are at the forefront of the fight.
I think one of the most important things in intersectionality is the validity of those that came before us, that we could give any of the other groups that have worked for justice, for workers, for immigrants, for racial justice. If we are becoming a coalition, and open to being allies to other fights, just like you mentioned, like it's true. It's we will be giving validity to the intersectionality and how this collective fight, is truly that. It's a collective fight, and something that happened in the '60s is something we're still probably fighting about right now, fighting for, and it's important that we first acknowledge those who fought for us first, and then continue to intersect with new groups, even if the fight is hundreds of years old or thousands of years old now. Make sure that we're there to connect with them, and you're right, self-determination. Any specific group will self-determine. Something that you made me think of that I'm always trying to argue about. Sometimes we talk about dual immersion, for example, in elementary schools, and it's so sad that what we're really actually fighting for is to retain not the European, not the Mayflower colonizers' language, but we want the Spanish, colonizers' language, right? But I think it's a necessary fight, because that'll open the doors for then starting to focus on indigenous language as well. That's something that we could be doing simultaneously, right? But if we can't even retain Spanish, it's ridiculous. So it's important that we continue to fight these and continue to intersect and make sure we are representing our folks. And you're right, saying Latino, saying everybody's a Mexicano or a Chicano, I think we all have a right to represent ourselves as we see ourselves, but then also intersect with other folks and meeting them where they're at.
Thank you.
So I teach leadership courses at Lake Community College and have 3 students in this group here. But what I teach is about transformational leadership, which means what story we have been given to approach things. And unfortunately, as has been mentioned by the panelists, the story that's been given to us to look at things has been in separation, in disconnection to others. And so in the class I teach this term, Quien Soy, Quien Somos, students come with a story about Latino being native Indian and Spanish, as if there's no African descent experiences or Asian descent or European and all that. So it's part of breaking out of that mindset that it is possible, the intersectionality of all these issues. When I had a chance to meet Cesar Chavez on a few occasions as well with my work with the Mecha group at the University of Oregon. And my generation in the 60s and 70s, Chicano generation, we wanted to reaffirm Chavez as a Chicano leader. And so that was my story. I said, yeah, he's a speaker for our community. But basically, when I heard him say to us that were present, you know what, yeah, fine, I'm a labor organizer, right? But my framework was to see him as a Chicano leader. And he says, I'm a labor organizer. So that kind of addressed my notion of just single story in Cesar Chavez. And so, as an educator, I do a lot of assessments or research on textbooks, because I want to know what story's been given to the general public about Latinos, Mexican Americans. And sure, you'll see Cesar Chavez coming up during the civil rights movement, but I want to see him in a labor history class. I want to see him in a labor textbook, because that's his thing, right? And so it is very difficult to break out of a single story that we've been given and reinforce, not only through the media, but to our education, perhaps to your friends and all that. Everyone's single story. We need to get away from that. I can tell you this, that there are plenty of examples in the history of this country where intersectionality is happening, where there was always collaboration by groups. There's plenty of examples of that. But it is a concealed story. And it's concealed so that we can continue on with our single story, that we've never collaborated. And so, yeah, do your own investigation. It's pretty interesting.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Okay, I'm Cameron. I have a much smaller question regarding your EFI thing. Would it be also useful if we were to approach other stores that we shop at and ask if they want to get on board with that, or?
Yeah, I would ask them to do a comment card and just put, hey, have you considered carrying EFI product?
Thank you. I think we'll take one or two more questions.
Cool. Hey, thanks. This was another quick EFI question. That's great and like that. Very practical.
Your name, please.
Josh. My name is Josh. I was just curious if there was any work in that initiative, like pressuring larger buyers, like large restaurant chains and like other grocery stores, and how we could support efforts like that, as our buying power as individuals is like really small, and maybe some of us,
yeah, it would be the same strategy. I mean, as going into other retailers and just saying, would you consider looking or buying EFI product? We, in addition to Costco and Whole Foods, we also have Bon Appetit. Now, I'm not sure if there's any schools here that carry Bon Appetit, but I know that Willamette University, Lewis and Clark, Reed College, and some other places up north carry or cafeterias that are Bon Appetit. And then if, restaurants, just write a comment, said, consider doing this. This is the right thing to do.
Thank you. Anybody else have any more to add to that? Well, I think that, Lisa?
Not so much a question, but to give Ramon a chance to talk about the families who are in need of help.
Yeah, we're, there's a raid that took place last week in Woodburn, Oregon. One affected a family of 5, the other one a family of 10. And they, the good thing is that nobody got arrested. Because we've done over 52 workshops around the state about Know Your Rights. And when the ICE went, folks didn't answer the door. But the terror that happened afterwards, right? The fear, people had to, the first thing people did was wanting to move out. The first family is okay. The second family is not. In addition to the fear and the anxiety, they need to move out because ICE is going to come back. So we're looking for a place for them to stay, and so we're raising money right now. We have a GoFundMe page, but also in all presentations, we have the Willamette Valley Rapid Response Team. Every presentation we're doing, we're raising money. So I'm going to pass this around, and if people want to donate whatever they can, all the funds will go directly to help this family of 10. All they're asking for is a place to stay. And they're all farm workers. At the time that ICE came to their house, they were working in the wine grape. They were picking grapes for a major winery. Through the kindness of other folks, we were able to put them up in a hotel for a few days. And we want to continue that because they can't go back home or else they'll get arrested. So that's all I have to say. And so, yeah, I think one of the things that we are doing around the state is that we've decided that in any place, any city that there's a major raid, that our organization called the Willamette Valley Rapid Response Team, which is that does trainings and Know Your Rights trainings and sets up committees for helping people, that if anything happens here in Eugene, we would be, responding to your assistance. We would help you guys out. In case of a family getting arrested or whatever assistance you need from us, you can count on us. And we did the same thing on Friday. We met with the Portland Immigrant Rights Coalition up in Portland, and we have an agreement now. And we're trying to bring in people from Medford, from Bend, from Hood River, the Dalles, and all those communities to help each other out. Because divided, if we're divided and we're not connected, we're weak. If we're united, we're stronger to help our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And more comments, please?
Well, I did want to speak a little bit about, corrective history, right? Corrective history is very powerful, and we've seen it play out with Indigenous Peoples Day, for example. I'm reminded of that since it's coming up. How we were, and a lot of activists around the state, despite Oregon being a state that does not celebrate Columbus Day, a lot of folks think, because we're so progressive, right? But it's really not because of that. It was because in the 20s, it was largely anti-Italian, and the KKK was the face of trying to get rid of Columbus Day. At the end of the day, we got to that point, but not because of our progressive nature, right? So that has to be a real, a fact that permeates in your discussions around that. So thanks to Indigenous Peoples Day, I think that there's a rise in pride and a rise in real talk about what Columbus was and meant for so many decades, truly meant, and who that man was. So in the same sense, it's important that we keep correcting history. Even the best and most just of our fights, collective fights for our gente, can actually be riddled and overtaken by patriarchy, right? So we saw, and I'm very happy that through the Dolores Huerta, the movie for Dolores, it helps us continue to face history with honesty and courage. So as I mentioned, the film Dolores did exactly that. And the fire needed in the fight for workers came from this woman, right? She at many times had to kind of justify her choice of lifestyle, right? As if fighting for justice, fighting for a gente was a choice, right? I see a lot of mi gente here too, and I know that it's never been a choice. We've got to do that work. And another thing she gave us is allowing our community to articulate clearly que sí se puede, right? Thanks to her. And in that same train of thought, and the fact that even patriarchy permeates our own movements a lot, I'd like to invite you all, maybe I'm beating Jim Garcia to the punch here, but I want to invite you all to Connie Mezquita, a celebration for Connie Mezquita, a long-standing Latina leader, Chicana leader here in Lane County. We will be naming the Multicultural Center in her honor, Connie Mezquita, in a place where all the buildings are mostly named after white men. This is going to be very, very awesome. So it'll be Thursday the 12th at 4:30 p.m. in the Multicultural Center at LCC. And, right? Smash the patriarchy, right?
Thank you. We have one more question. One more question. And your name, please.
Edith Roberts. And I just want to put out an idea that relates to some of what you were saying about cultural values and also the indigenous backgrounds of many farm workers, that because of climate change and the problems that industrial agriculture contribute to that a lot of the knowledge and ability of farm workers could be used in trying to shift to regenerative agriculture. Smaller farms, more people working on farms, a more agrarian culture. I would just like to have that be part of your discussion when you talk about intersectionality.
Thank you.
That's a very good point, and I just want to give a couple examples of what's happening in this state, and then also in other places, right? That's a very good question, and there's a movement, and it's led on different fronts, but there's a movement, there's a group called Via Campesina, and it's...
Very much what I...
Okay. So Via Campesina, we've actually, PCUN has made an application to become a member of Via Campesina. And it's a gathering of small farmers and farmers without land, or farm workers without land, throughout Latin America, Africa, Asia, and North America. And so one of its major tasks, I believe, was to stop the agricultural provisions from happening in the WTO. And they shut down the negotiations. And that is really good because the negotiations were going to lead to the industrialization of farm labor and agriculture in the world. So they have, there's a movement that's being led by Via Campesina to not only go to developing new methods of sustainable agriculture, but also documenting and saving, literally saving the old seeds that our indigenous brothers and sisters all over the world, right, including in North America, to save it, for the future, for our future generations. I happen to work with a couple of Indian tribes from different parts of New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Montana, where the tribes are now going back and starting to save their indigenous seeds, right, for corn, wheat, and a bunch of other things. The group in New Mexico is actually developing different ways of developing waterways so that they can irrigate and not pollute the earth. In Oregon, there is a farm in McMinnville called Nahuatl Product Farms, Organic Farms, and we were part of a group that they had a celebration closing their annual harvest, in which they brought indigenous folks from. They brought some folks from Tarahumara, from Apache. They had folks from Mixteco and also Purepecha. And they had a celebration. And I would say that at times during the years, we've sold product here, organic strawberries. We can open up that front again if people are interested. We were selling organic union label product in Eugene up to a couple years ago. I think this past summer was the only year we didn't sell it, but if there's the interest, we could do that again. And it's an interesting concept. It's all organic, and we're producing a lot of chilies. He has about 30 different varieties of chili from Oaxaca, for example. And it's organic, and it's this is a spark of a new movement. I think not only to make agriculture more sustainable, but more healthy for all.
And more food security.
Yes.
In rural areas and cities.
And he's the only grower that pays more than $13 an hour to farm workers. So in addition, the farm workers are working not with pesticides, but they're working with organic products and getting paid a decent wage. I mean, $13 is not a decent wage in my book, but it's more than any other agricultural worker makes working piece rate crops in Oregon, by far. Thank you.
Any other comments?
I just had a question, like super detailed, but so when you talk about like farm workers aren't subject to labor laws, does that mean that they don't have minimum wage doesn't apply to farm workers?
Yeah, farm workers, the problem with minimum wage is that is lack of enforcement. So under state law, for example, I'll just take piece rate crops. Those are crops that you get paid by the pound that you pick.
And so historically, those are not subject to minimum wage.
No, they
laws,
are.
right? Oh, they are?
We have fought tooth and nail to make sure that farm workers are covered through by minimum wage laws. So technically, I mean, this is how it should work. So if you're a farm worker and you pick piece rate, and you don't make what's equivalent to $10.25 an hour. This area is a second tier, right? I
Yes,
believe so.
yes.
I believe
Yeah.
it's $10.25. If you don't make what's equivalent to $10.25, then the grower has to make up the difference. Now, it all depends on your pay period. So for example, if you're paid on a daily rate, you have to that day, if you're getting paid cash, for example, that day you get paid, you're supposed to, and you work 10 hours, you know, you're supposed to make, you know, $125 that day. What's happening is that we're finding out, we did a study on the new minimum wage law, and we found out that 90% of the farm workers on any given day are shortchanged their minimum wage. The growers are not making up the difference. Right? So what you pick is what you get paid. And so we've reported
Even though
that
that's illegal.
That's illegal. That's against the law. Because under state law, workers are supposed to get paid minimum wage, period. Whether you get paid by piece rate or not. But the growers are not making up the difference. The problem lies, there's two problems. One is that a lot of the farm workers are being recruited from other states and don't know that the minimum wage here is a lot higher. And the second is enforcement. We don't have enough agents from the Bureau of Labor and Industries to go out and enforce the law. So when the law doesn't get enforced, then you don't have the law. So when we talk about that they're not getting paid minimum wage, it's not all farm workers, it's piece rate farm workers. But that's a big group. We're talking about 30 or 40,000 people in the state that work for piece rate. So that's a big problem. In addition to that, in addition to violations of minimum wage law, there's a lot of violations of a bunch of other stuff. You know, we recently worked really hard to get workers covered under the paid sick leave. And what we're finding out is that the growers are not paying the paid sick leave. Because they're saying it's the responsibility of the labor contractors to do that. So now what we have to do is do a whole education project, and we've let boldly the agencies in charge of that to let them know that we gotta concentrate on that because, again, workers are being shortchanged. Under state law, you have, for every 30 hours that you work, 1 hour goes to paid sick leave for the first 90 days. And then you can earn up to 40 hours a year. You know, so that's almost that's a week's pay. And what we're finding out is a lot of workers last year, when the law came to fruition, that their rights were being violated. And there's not enough agents to enforce the law. So this year, we were able to get, I believe, 5 new agents for bowling. And I understand that Oregon OSHA, got 9 agents. But that's because of the hard work of the labor movement. Because we put pressure on our senators and our House reps. And we told them, we explained to them that what's going on. And that's just in farm labor. We're seeing wholesale violations of paid sick leave law and minimum wage in construction, service, food processing, and home care workers. So we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes our panel discussion tonight. I would like to, on behalf of Beyond Toxics and everyone here in Eugene and Lane County, thank each and every one of you for your contribution in fighting for justice and equality. Thank you.